So I was trained not to cook, not specifically ever, not by my family, but I think by our culture overall. When I was growing up, I looked forward to the nights that we could have TV dinners. It was exciting. It meant that my mom had a little bit more time to spend with us, and it was the 70s, so there was this novelty around that processed food. You know, the astronauts were out in space drinking Tang, and we were all about that. Astronauts were the thing. Then I went to college. Things got a little bit harder because I learned about local economies, and I learned about food systems, and I learned a little bit about health, and I had to really struggle with the notion of giving up my fondness for brown cinnamon sugar Pop-Tarts and balance that against the fresh apples and locally produced cheeses. I went to school in Vermont. So food was important then, but it wasn't critical. Now, when I go to procure food from anywhere, I totally have Michael Pollan's omnivore's dilemma. I'm overwhelmed. And I don't know, what are we shooting for? Do we prioritize local or organic or cruelty-free? And what do we do with something like this? This is front and back side of the same product, okay? And on the right side, I think, yeah, this is great, I'm in. But then I look at the left side and I think, 3 continents, 1 pound of cow. And that scares me a good bit. I think it should probably scare us all. So I want to talk today a little bit about what we're eating for. How do we make choices? What do we think about when we think about food? I have the opportunity to teach a great class at the University of Utah called Eating for Justice, Health, and Sustainability. And I love this course. I love it because I get to work with grad and undergraduate students for 15 weeks, and we get to think about what do we eat? Why do we eat it? And is it important what we eat? Does it even matter? We all approach food in so many ways. Sometimes we're eating for comfort. Sometimes it's for freshness or flavor. Sometimes it's because it's convenient or cheap, some combination of all of those. We came up with this model, pretty basic model, just about the different ways people approach food. For pure pleasure, for justice, health, and sustainability, or maybe a little less critically than that. So the pure pleasure model, we all probably know folks like this. Maybe some of us are lucky enough to be these folks where you think about what does the food smell like? What does it taste like? What's the presentation of it like? How can I pick the perfect wine to bring out the perfect flavors of that food? Really approaching food as a full leisure experience. Then there are folks that eat a little differently. I'm going to point at the right thing. There we go. Eating for justice, health, and sustainability. And let me give you an example of this. I have a student who wrote, "Now I'm not one to buy beef on a regular basis, mostly because of the methane emissions that come from factory farmed and grass-fed cows alike, and also because of the conflicts between ranchers and natural predators, and the fact that cows graze on public land." That's a lot more than pleasure she's going on. That's a lot, right? She's looking for global health. She's looking at global health. Eaters in this category would generally select foods that don't exploit human workers or other animals, that support local growers and promote local control over food, that don't take a lot of fertilizers or pesticides or a lot of fossil fuels, either in their production or their transportation to us, and foods that aren't genetically modified. Foods that are high in protein and vitamin content, and foods, I think, overall that make you feel good not only when you're eating them, but even a few hours later. And it's interesting because we're lucky enough in Salt Lake City to even be able to choose restaurants with this in mind. We've got a few restaurants that are working towards providing us with food that's just and sustainably produced. So this is also a leisured approach to food. I mean, there's choice there. People can make choices about that. And it's funny to think of leisure as political, but I think it's an important way to think about leisure because really the revolution's not going to happen on the clock, right? So the other way to think about eating is eating uncritically. This is probably the way a lot of us eat a lot of the time. I have a friend from Alabama. He eats Chick-fil-A 4 times a week. He likes it. He just likes the way it tastes. It's convenient. It's there. He's happy with that. So these eaters, they maybe don't have this general orientation toward food. Maybe they haven't thought about it a lot. Maybe they just eat out of habit. So yeah. So looking at this model, maybe you can think about where you fit into it, and maybe you think a little bit of each place. The idea is just that there are a few sort of general orientations or approaches we have toward food. So while you might sort of live mostly in this justice, health, and sustainability category, certainly you'll put those parameters aside from time to time, like in the face of brown sugar cinnamon Pop-Tarts, for example. So I want to think a little bit. Well, there are other places, I guess, to mention that crossover can occur. Like the slow food movement, they definitely have an emphasis on pleasure. That's huge. But they want to use that pleasure to help protect agrodiversity and to help maintain the local experience. And then there are also folks, I think, who, when they see a label that talks about something being humanely raised or it has a certain nutritional content, they'll go that way, but they might not think about it on their own. They might not be the primary thing in their minds when they're shopping. So I want to think a little bit about the idea of eating for anything. There's no denying that it's a privileged perspective. The idea that we can eat for, that we can think about what we're going to eat, that we can choose. And it's really in stark contrast to the idea that 1 in 8 people around the globe are hungry. 1 in 8. And then particularly horrifying, since we're speaking Salt Lake and Utah, 1 in 5 kids is food insecure. 1 in 5 kids don't know when they're going to eat next. They don't know where their next meal is coming from. And this last thing, telling us that it's over 20% of families with kids that struggle to buy food. So that's kind of somber, but there's good news. The good news is that there's more than enough food to feed everyone. That's not the problem. The problem is a problem of access. The problem is how we grow and produce and sell and trade this food. That puts it both financially and often geographically out of reach for many, even in places, and especially in places where farming used to be the norm. So I wanted to show you this overall model. I think what it helps us understand is that it's the agro-industrial food chain that actually creates and enforces this imbalance. And if we think about what our role can be, we think about eating for justice, health, and sustainability as one movement towards keeping ourselves individually healthy, at the same time maybe as working towards eroding this other model, this other agro-industrial food chain. There are many of us, myself included, that were born into privilege. I get to choose what to eat for. I can vote with my fork about whether or not, how farmers get treated, or about pesticides and fertilizers. I can vote about the commodification of seeds. I can vote about globalized production, which in many cases is just hidden slavery, where we move the impacts of production out of our sight. And that level of privilege, that's not limited to the 1%. So when we think about that some of us can do this and some of us can't, we have to start asking why. Why is it that we as a community allow 1 in 5 kids in Utah to be food insecure? What are the stories that we tell ourselves? What are the cultural narratives that we have that make that even a possibility for us to get up knowing that every day? And I think one of them is the idea that people in poverty somehow deserve their circumstance. They're lazy, right? Or maybe we tell ourselves that the folks who pick our fruit, if they don't have citizenship status, deserve our scorn because they're stealing American jobs rather than deserving health care or fair wages. These are things that are either told to us or some of us take as given, or probably in this audience, some of us try really hard to forget as often as we can. This is one of my students, and he's struggling with the idea of his own privilege, saying that understanding the role of privilege in his own life and letting go of the narcissistic idea that his achievements are the result simply of his own work seems to be the key to beginning to truly help others, to make the transition from charity to solidarity. He's grappling with some pretty big stuff. He's trying to come to terms with the idea that while giving someone in the street $5 is great for that person and it might alleviate their suffering and it's probably a worthwhile thing to do, it's not going to put a dent in the system. He's starting to realize that he got dealt a pretty good hand in this lifetime. And that calls on him to potentially realize that other people didn't. And it's not because they're flawed or because they don't love their kids, right? They just didn't get that same hand. And it's that recognition that helps him move from a charity mode of thinking to a solidarity mode of thinking. So that's kind of weighty. It's kind of weighty stuff. We notice that politicians don't talk about poverty, right? Does anyone ever say poverty? And they don't talk about wealth. We can strengthen the middle class. That's what we can do. But still, we have these sort of myths that we live by. And when we recognize our place in this system, for me, I mean, I'm not the architect of the system, but I definitely benefit from it. I participate in it. There's a certain extent to which I can choose my level of complicity in this system. And I think that's important stuff when we start to think about building a movement and how that movement might proceed. This situation is so complex. It's one where we use food aid. It's one where we use international trade agreements to make sure that folks stay food dependent rather than food independent. It's one that prioritizes profit over human health. So it's a big question my students and I are faced with. What do we do? What do we do with this? So our strategy is to go out into the community and to meet some change makers. So we meet Mike and Andrea Heidinger, who are here, by the way. Several years ago, they started a Eat Local challenge. They just read an article in Orion magazine about an Eat Local challenge in Vermont. They threw it out to a few people. Hey, what do you think? Suddenly, 50 people are on board, working together to figure out what local food sources do we have? What do we need to substitute in recipes for the things that we don't have, like olive oil that we can't get locally? They had barter events. They had potlucks. They shared their house with folks who used to be strangers all around food, around an experiment, really. We go and we meet Sharon Leopardi. Sharon, who's here also, graduated from the U of U's Environmental Studies program just 3 years ago. And she left that program thinking about farming and about food, and she undertook the hard work of starting a farm, a community-supported agriculture business called Bug Farms, stands for Backyard Urban Gardens. Her members, aside from the traditional benefits of CSAs like fresh produce and supporting your community and your community's economy, they also get to see food production in a different way. See, Sharon's not a large landowner. Sharon farms on the land of her neighbors, and she does that in exchange for feeding them for 5 months of the year. Some of them aren't into the vegetables and the produce, that's not really their thing, but regardless of that, they're witness to a different vision of how the food movement can look. So for Sharon and her members, the production of food isn't based on private property, and it isn't based on expensive equipment or purchasing expensive seed. It's based on community. It's based on farming. It's based on food. We also get to work with and hear from the folks at Utahns Against Hunger. These folks do more than growing food for those that need it, although they do that too. They actually go out and work with diverse high school groups, teaching students how to grow their own food, how to cook this food. They teach these kids the value of eating this food from a nutritional standpoint, from a community development standpoint, from an economic standpoint. So these three folks, these three projects are run by fairly ordinary people who just did extraordinary things. All of them did three things that I think are really important and worth mentioning. One is they recognized their own privilege, and then they used that privilege to build this thing that's larger than just changing their own eating. The second thing they did is they created these networks so that their voices and their work could be amplified. And finally, they really provided us with a new vision, a new way that food could look. I take us back to this picture because I think really for all of us the temptation, should we even make it to that middle circle, would be to stop there. I'm good. I eat for justice, health, and sustainability. Instead of thinking, like these folks have done, about how to erode that fulcrum, how to erode that structure. I swear there's one more. There we go. Let me introduce you to just two more change makers. Supriya and Grace Henley. They work for the International Rescue Committee and for Salt Lake County. They work at a refugee farm, and it's a 3-acre plot of land. My students and I are blown away by this place every year, not only by the diversity of flavors that exist there, but also by the stories that this landscape can tell about hunger and about food insecurity. So maybe many of you recognize these leaves. They're squash leaves. And if you recognize them, you might be saying to yourself, I've never eaten a squash leaf. Can you eat squash leaves? The answer is yes, they are edible. And if you've spent your life food insecure, then yes, you eat them. And if this compromises the production of the squash later, then so be it. Because food insecurity changes us. It changes how we see food. It really changes how we see everything. And having a visual reminder, a landscape scale reminder, was really an awakening for my students and I, again, about this hunger issue. Supriya and Grace are engaged by and engage with refugees from all over, from Chad and Bhutan and Burma, Burundi. They work not only to consider how food from refugee homelands can survive in Salt Lake City, but they also have a seed-saving program, so eventually working towards food sovereignty. They also have a farm stand where they sell generally, but they also sell to restaurants in the valley, which provides an income for many of these refugees. Of course, it's one of many jobs that they have. But together, they build this landscape of all kinds of flavors, of all kinds of new species, of all kinds of new things to try. But the amazing thing that happens there, the really amazing thing that gets built there, is the knowledge of other people's lifestyles and other people's experiences, of people who have been dealt really challenging hands and still are not led down the path of cheap processed food, but instead will select responsibly grown and healthy food. There's a quote I love from Josh Rattel that says, "Empathy calls solidarity into being." Let me give you that again. Empathy calls solidarity into being. And our experiences at this farm have been in no way inconsequential to our struggle. Eric Holt Jimenez and Ann Shattuck tell us food sovereignty, food justice, and the right to food all depend on building a unified food movement, diverse enough to address all aspects of the food system, and powerful enough to challenge the main obstacle to food security, the corporate food regime. And no one's saying it's simple, but it might be worth it. We have to look at our own complicity in this overly complex system and think about that. Me, I'm still trying to get off the Pop-Tarts. Thank you.